in the shadowed corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where sumptuous tapestries concealed more than cold stone walls, King Henry VIII's carnal desires first began to stir. In the year 1509, the young Tudor prince, standing approximately 1.83 meters tall, strong, intelligent, and skilled in the tilt yard, officially ascended the throne, dubbed the Golden Prince for his radiant looks and graceful bearing. Henry made a powerful impression on both the public and his courtiers. From the very start of his reign, he married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, who was 5 years his senior, and publicly displayed what appeared to be devoted affection for his bride. But beneath that dazzling veneer, his sexual appetite grew wilder and more uncontrollable. Like a stallion that could not be bridled, Henry believed that his prodigious virility was a divine sign, affirming his sovereign authority, as if each act of lovemaking were a proclamation that God had chosen him as ruler of the realm. In a country still governed by strict Catholic doctrine, where adultery was deemed a national disgrace, the Tudor court operated by its own unwritten laws. Once the king bestowed favour upon someone, that person must comply or face severe consequences. Thus, the court became a velvet prison where power overrode all else, and even a whispered invitation or a single lingering glance from the king could send a lady's heart racing and knees trembling in fear of his wrath. Unlike most European monarchies that kept extramarital affairs discreet, Henry took the opposite approach. He openly hinted at his romantic conquests, as if advertising a product rather than hiding these dalliances. His court leaked rumours, made formal announcements, and even paraded newly favoured women before the Queen, young girls with innocent faces and tear-filled eyes, clutching jewellery boxes or newly gifted castle keys, would emerge shyly from the royal chambers. Having just been declared the king's lucky conquest, Catherine, forced to maintain a sorrowful smile, had to endure acting as the reluctant showroom alongside a wife who was now a stranger in her own palace. The whispers swelled into a thunderous drumbeat, underscoring Henry's amorous exploits. He flaunted his base desires without shame, from pearl-covered nipple clamps to feathered accessories and velvet scarves, custom-made to stimulate his most sensitive spots. Some historians later recounted that the king once draped black velvet curtains around his bed to create an aura of mystery, so that his attendants had to fumble through the darkness as if lost in a maze before encountering their sacrificial goddess. Whenever he sought relief, the king would summon a roster of hand-picked ladies in waiting, rigorously trained to meet his exacting criteria. They had to be graceful, obedient, and yet creatively inventive, according to later chroniclers. On some occasions, Henry demanded that they experiment with novel positions so bizarre that even modern audiences would blush at the description. One popular anecdote tells of the king bringing an actual swing chair into his bedchamber, hoping to transform lovemaking into a romantic aerial promenade. Inevitably, the floating courtship ended in awkward laughter and a scattering of torn pillows. Within Henry's labyrinth of love affairs, the ordinary and the peculiar merged. On one occasion, courtiers reported that the king instructed a novice handmaiden to stroke his eyelids with peacock feathers for added arousal. On another, he placed a rare orchid in his bedchamber, solely so he could inhale its fragrance before retiring. Each ostensibly superfluous detail contributed to a distinctive cult, the cult of desire, and the rumours spread so quickly that terrified courtiers would whisper, "If you're summoned unexpectedly to the king's bedchamber, pray first, then summon all your courage." Yet Henry did not stop at personal gratification. He weaponized his lust for political gain. Every lady favoured by the king received titles, lands, and a place in court propaganda designed to symbolize Tudor power. Noble families watched greedily, offering their daughters to the monarch as if wagering their very lives in a high-stakes competition for influence. And as they admired his largesse with both awe and dread, the king would smirk, as if saying, "The game has only just begun." Thus, with each measured step, Henry took through the halls of Hampton Court, carnal appetite and sovereign might merged into a singular, unsettling symphony. The hypnotic, somnolent tone of this tale might lull listeners toward a dreamy trance. Yet beneath those languid words lies the electrifying and slightly blush-inducing world of a king whose erotic escapades once terrified all of Europe. After more than 2 decades of sharing a bed, Catherine endured 24 years of public humiliation. She bore in silence the shame of seeing her own ladies-in-waiting, many barely out of girlhood, come and go in the palace, each carrying jewels or parcels of land bestowed by the king. Henry gradually withdrew from his wife's chambers, immersing himself in a relentless and ruthless hunt for fresh conquests. In the year 1519, Elizabeth Bessie Blount, one of the earliest ladies-in-waiting, unexpectedly became pregnant by the king. The joy of finally having a son, even if illegitimate, overwhelmed Henry to such an extent that he almost legitimized the child. He bestowed upon the boy the title Duke of Richmond, showered him with honours, and publicly declared that any fault for the lack of a male heir lay not with his sacred seed, but with the Queen's supposed barrenness. This act served as a double insult. It deeply wounded Catherine and drove a dagger straight through the honour of the Spanish princess. Yet in spite of this ephemeral triumph, Henry's affair with Bessie was merely a brief stop on his royal romance map. King Hamlet, Henry soon turned his attention elsewhere. Heedless of the political and personal fallout, the designation of the king's acknowledged mistress never guaranteed security. Once her usefulness waned or Henry's interest cooled, a mistress would be married off to a minor courtier and quietly removed from court life. The relationship would fizzle like a soap bubble in the morning sun. Bessie's rise and fall illustrated the brutal calculus of Tudor romance. At first, she basked in royal favour. She received splendid gowns, glittering jewels, and applause from courtiers who hoped to share in the king's largesse. But the moment she no longer served the king's dynastic ambitions, her star fell. She was married off with a handsome dowry. But the corridors she once walked so proudly became cold and unfamiliar. Her child, though publicly acknowledged and adored by Henry, was never truly accepted by the blossoming power structure at court. Henry's pattern repeated itself with mechanical predictability. He pursued a new mistress with the fervour of a man chasing a phantom, only to discard her when the thrill of pursuit gave way to boredom, or when she fulfilled her singular function. Each woman was but a pawn in his relentless quest for potency. Both in the bedchamber and on the political stage, the cycle of intense courtship, lavish gifts, passionate intimacy, and sudden abandonment unfolded again and again. A macabre dance set to the rhythm of Henry's insecurities. This relentless pursuit of new conquests came at a steep cost. Every public celebration of a mistress's pregnancy was also a public condemnation of Catherine, whose dignified endurance only seemed to stoke Henry's resentment. His court propagated the cruel narrative that Catherine's advanced age and repeated miscarriages were to blame for the lack of a male heir. Meanwhile, aspiring ladies-in-waiting whispered prayers of thanks if they were never summoned to the king's private chambers, for they knew that escaping Henry's attentions could be as much a blessing as being chosen. Yet Henry's appetites were no mere personal eccentricity. They shaped the very politics of his realm. When he publicly honoured Bessie and elevated her son, he rewrote the rules of succession in front of his court. Noble families, eager to align themselves with royal favour, began to view their daughters as currency, dispatching them to court like prized offerings. The palace became a marketplace of flesh and ambition, where marriage alliances and land grants were negotiated alongside whispered solicitations in candlelit corridors. And so, Bessie's fleeting glory underscored the precarious nature of being the king's pleasure. One day a lady could wear a crown of diamonds. The next, she might don the simple dress of an obscure baroness. Her earlier splendour reduced to a footnote in court chronicles. Better to remain unnoticed than to risk a sudden fall from favour. The precariousness of her position made every gesture before the king fraught with tension. Every blush and curtsy laden with potential peril. Thus did Henry's amorous exploits shape the very fabric of Tudor society. Every new mistress changed the balance of power, shifting allegiances and creating factions within the court. Courtiers who once lavished praise upon a favoured lady would quickly turn their backs when her star dimmed, lest they be caught out in association with someone the king had discarded. The walls of Hampton Court echoed with the silent prayers of women who yearned both to be unseen and, paradoxically, to be adored by the most powerful man in England. As Catherine continued her quiet endurance, and Bessie faded into the annals of court history, Henry's appetite remained unquenched. Each conquest, each child born beyond royal wedlock, each sudden dismissal only fueled his compulsions. The court watched in a mix of fascination and horror as the king's passions ricocheted between devotion and betrayal, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered reputations. And in the hush that followed each scandal, one could almost hear the faint echo of Catherine's unspoken lament, mingling with the hushed prayers of all those who would ever dare cross the path of Henry VIII. After more than 24 years in Henry's bedchamber, Mary Boleyn emerged as a shining star among his many mistresses. Courtiers whispered that she had borne the king at least 1 or 2 children, rumours that fueled envy and fascination within the palace walls. In recognition of her intimate and scandalous place in Henry's affections, he bestowed upon her a nickname as cutting as it was public, Madam Hore the Great. Though the epithet reeked of cruelty, Mary herself never protested. She understood her role to supply pleasure without complaint, receive jewels and land with a graceful nod, and then slip away quietly when the king's interest waned. Mary's tenure as the king's favourite followed the now familiar Tudor pattern. At first, she basked in royal favour, sumptuous gowns, glittering necklaces, and carriage rides through the palace grounds. Courtiers vied for her smile, hoping a nod from her in turn might earn them a share of Henry's generosity. But a mistress's value was fleeting, whether Mary exhausted her usefulness by becoming pregnant, or simply bored the king. She was swiftly married off to a minor courtier, one whose name barely flickered in the pages of history. In a single night, the trajectory of her life shifted from gilded halls to modest manor. Her child, though carrying a Tudor bloodline, was never officially recognized. The boy or girl vanished into obscurity. A silent testament to the king's whims, thus did the one morning, gone by evening motif, become a sad refrain for every lady-in-waiting in the court of the VIII Henry. Each new mistress endured the intoxicating rise, only to face an equally precipitous fall. Mary Boleyn's story, though uniquely fraught with gossip and lavish rewards, was little more than a prologue to the next chapter in Henry's restless heart. Enter Anne Boleyn, Mary's younger sister, whose ambition and steely resolve set her apart from her older siblings' quieter acquiescence. Anne arrived at court bearing an air of calculated detachment. She was neither overly coquettish nor easily dazzled by the king's power. Instead, she wielded wit and intellect like sharpened blades, teasing Henry's interest not with overt availability, but with artful restraint. Where Mary had given herself wholly, Anne offered only glimpses and arch eyebrow here, a well-timed jest there leaving the king ravenous for more. For years, Anne played her game with masterful patience. The most powerful man in England became a desperate suitor, his every thought consumed by the possibility of possessing her. He penned ardent letters, so spicy that even modern readers might blush at his metaphors, promising the moon, or at least the finest jewels, if she would deign to satisfy him. Anne entertained him with intellectual conversation, reciting Latin poetry or debating theology, all while ensuring that the possibility of physical intimacy remained tantalizingly out of reach. Her strategy bore fruit, frustrated by the barrage of refusals and inflamed by curiosity. Henry found himself prepared to upend centuries of religious tradition and political stability just to claim Anne Boleyn as his queen. He withdrew from Catherine in ever more dramatic fashion, prolonging annulment proceedings against his first wife for half a decade. He asserted that divine will mandated his union with Anne, that the Pope's refusal to dissolve his prior marriage was a personal affront to God's chosen ruler, England's break with Rome, the establishment of a national church, and the mobilization of Parliament all followed in Henry's wake, each step justified by his obsessive longing for Anne. Yet in this narrative of power and passion, Anne remained the enigma. She never surrendered control. Even when the king crowned her queen and she bore him a daughter instead of the coveted male heir, she moved through the palace with a calm confidence. Her presence was a constant reminder to Henry that desire thrives on uncertainty. Every glance she offered was measured, every smile precisely timed. And while Mary had yielded herself fully and been cast aside, Anne ensured that the king's hunger for her remained as potent on his wedding night as it was on the day he first spotted her at court. In the sleepy hush of the palace corridors, where servants tiptoed past closed doors and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the turrets, the story of the Boleyn sisters took on an almost mythical quality. Mary, the great whore, had paved the way with her silence and submission. Anne, the cunning architect of her own fate, had mastered the subtle art of transforming royal obsession into political upheaval. And Henry, once the radiant young prince, had become both puppet and tyrant, ensnared by his own lust, and willing to rewrite religious history to sate a single woman's whims. Thus, as the Tudor court drifted toward dramatic and irreversible change, it was clear that Henry's greatest conquests would not be on the battlefield, nor in diplomatic treaties, but within the tangled web of his own desires. The Boleyn sisters, each in her turn, had shown that in Henry's England, the politics of the bedroom could reshape the very foundations of a nation. 7 long years, Anne Boleyn held the king at bay, and Henry endured a weary journey of relentless rejection. His surviving love letters read like the lamentations of a schoolboy passing secret notes in a dusky classroom, pleading to kiss each gentle curve of her neck, referring to her breasts as pretty little ducklings, and promising her the treasures of the entire realm in exchange for a single embrace. His yearning took on a theological sheen, as though carnal desire were the very proof of national sovereignty. In his mind, God had not only crowned him king, but also appointed him the world's living testament to masculine potency. Throughout those 7 years, Henry's correspondence with Anne grew increasingly vivid and increasingly desperate. He wrote of waking in the cold dawn, heart aching for her warmth. He described dreams that left him trembling, as though her soft sigh had become his lifeblood. He spoke of meditating on her smile, as though it were scripture, and compared the ache in his loins to a holy fire that only she could quench. Each letter was sealed with his signet ring, dipped with more hope, each time he feared it might never reach her. Meanwhile, the Pope in Rome stood firm against annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine, to His Holiness. Dissolving a sacred vow was an affront to divine order. Rome would not bend to Henry's demands, nor to his pleas that the church tribunal must yield. Around the king's candlelit table, theologians and courtiers debated in hushed tones the legitimacy of such an annulment. Henry, exasperation creeping into his regal voice, proclaimed that God's will had been thwarted by earthly pride. If the papacy refused to honour his sacred duty to secure a male heir, he would simply discharge its authority. Thus Henry delivered his coup. He broke England's ties with Rome, declaring himself supreme head of the new Church of England. He enacted statutes dissolving papal jurisdiction, confiscating abbey lands, and consecrating his own court as the final arbiter in matters of marriage and faith. In doing so, he legitimized his relationship with Anne Boleyn and effectively stripped Catherine of any claim to royal status. No longer would any priest or prelate outside his realm pronounce on his marriage. He alone would be judge, jury, and bridegroom. Drowsily, he awaited the moment when Anne's body would bear witness to his triumph. In the year 1533, the word came that she was with child, a daughter, then believed by Henry to be a son, destined to continue Tudor rule. He announced before Parliament that his union with Catherine was void from the start. That divine providence had graced him with a new queen, whose womb alone could secure the future. The walls of Westminster Hall seemed to echo with the weight of his pronouncement: divorce granted, allegiance to Rome severed, and the English crown now enthroned above the cross. Anne, who had eluded him for so long, now found herself at the centre of an upheaval that reshaped church and state. She carried the precious secret of royal paternity, and with each languid step through the gilded halls, she embodied the king's ultimate conquest. Henry, once rejected and chastened, now strode beside her as both sovereign and husband, his long quest culminating in a union he deemed sanctified by his own divine right. Yet in the hush of evening, when courtiers had drifted back to their chambers and torches guttered in the corner, a faint echo of Catherine's quiet dignity would still drift through the court. The queen whom he had cast aside remained a silent testament to the fragility of vows, while Anne reigned as living proof of his resolve. His break with Rome, once unthinkable, now lay enshrined in law and custom, marking a transformation that would outlast his mortal years. In that sleep-soft moment between victory and doubt, Henry VIII reclined on his velvet chaise, lulled by the rhythmic chant of new prayers in the Anglican communion. He had achieved his dearest desire to possess Anne Boleyn and to crown her as queen, and in doing so, he had redefined the very soul of his kingdom. Yet even as he drifted towards slumber, the memory of those 7 years of yearning, of whispered letters and denied embraces, hung over him like a half-remembered dream, an echo of desire that no act of state could ever fully still. Only a brief while after his lavish wedding to Anne, Henry's restless passions turned elsewhere. He set his sights on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, where Anne had resisted, remaining ever just beyond reach. Jane offered the gentle compliance that the king found infinitely soothing. In his fervour, Henry felt both triumphant and strangely relieved to meet no further resistance. Yet for Anne, those shifting affections spelled doom. She could no longer retreat behind the shield of courtly intrigue. In the year 1536, Anne found herself accused of adultery with no fewer than 5 men, including her own brother. The charges were so preposterous that even the judges appointed by Henry blinked in astonishment. Adultery, incest, treason. Each allegation seemed cobbled together purely to justify her removal. The court proceedings, a perfunctory spectacle, concluded almost before they began. Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was beheaded on Tower Green, a chilling message to every woman in England. If you rise by the force of desire, you can fall by the same measure of disgust. In the hush that followed her execution, the corridors of the palace felt empty, yet tension lingered in every tapestry-lined hallway. Anne's downfall had been swift, yet always foreseen by those who understood Henry's volatile heart. He had turned her affection into a political storm, and then discarded her when her usefulness had waned. Now, with Anne's severed head displayed for all to see, the king felt a curious blend of sorrow and vindication. He had conquered his greatest desire, but at a cost that left the realm breathless. Enter Jane Seymour, who, unlike her predecessors, seemed to offer something deeper than mere compliance, where Catherine aged with quiet dignity and Mary obeyed with silent grace. Jane listened with an empathetic tilt of her head. She ministered to Henry's ailing body, attending his leg wounds and wincing at his laboured breathing, as though she felt every throb of pain. She soothed him with soft words at midnight, tender as a lullaby, and never once pressed for more than he offered. To Henry, wearied by battles, both physical and romantic, Jane was a balm to his bruised spirit. In the deep hush of a summer's dawn, the news spread. Jane Seymour was with child. Henry, long haunted by the spectre of barren wombs and broken oaths, felt hope bloom in his chest. He spoke of a son as though reciting scripture, telling courtiers he would name the boy Edward, after his beloved father. He walked the palace gardens with a lighter step, his once tormented visage softened by anticipation. For once, the court seemed to share a collective breath of relief, as though England itself had been waiting for this moment. When the child arrived, Edward Tudor, it was said that the very air in the royal nursery shimmered with possibility. 12 days later, however, tragedy struck Jane's health. Weakened by childbirth, could not withstand the ordeal. Her spirit slipped away like a sigh, and she died in gentle mourning for the son she had given the world. In that sorrowful hour, Henry's grief rang genuine. He knelt by her bedside, tears clinging to his cheeks like dew on morning roses. He mourned her more deeply than any previous queen, calling her "my true love" in whispered prayers. Yet even this profound sorrow could not bind Henry's heart indefinitely. Within weeks, he was consulting marriage treaties once more, eyes drifting toward fresh alliances and new faces. Jane, in her brief tenure, it had achieved a rare distinction. She was the only one of Henry's 6 wives for whom he felt genuine regret before once again indulging his carnal and dynastic obsessions. Henry's reign thus wove marriage and sexuality into the very fabric of power. Each union was both an act of state and a weapon of terror. With Catherine, he shattered religious authority. With Anne, he redefined royal prerogative. With Jane, he glimpsed paternal hope, only to witness mortality's final decree. His bedchamber became a theatre of ambition, where every embrace carried the weight of crowns and the risk of downfall. In the sleepy hush of the palace, courtiers would recount these events in hushed voices, their heads nodding as if lulled by the rhythm of history's tragedies. They would recall the once vibrant Anne, her defiant smile fading beneath the executioner's axe, and Jane, whose kindness blossomed only to be clipped by the cruel hand of fate. And beneath all these stories, a softer, lingering lesson whispered that when a king's lust and law intertwine, the line between love and terror, between devotion and destruction, becomes irrevocably blurred. After the tragedy of Jane Seymour, Henry's advisors laboured tirelessly to find him a new bride, one who could both cement diplomatic alliances and sate his restless desires. In the year 1540, they settled on Princess Anne of Cleves, a Protestant match that promised favour with the German princes. A lavish portrait arrived at court, depicting Anne's radiant beauty in all its glory. Henry, wearied by past disappointments, yet ever hopeful, studied the image by candlelight, convinced that he beheld a vision worthy of the English crown. When Anne of Cleves finally set foot on English soil, the moment proved far less enchanting. Henry stepped forward, expecting to greet a queenly figure, only to encounter a woman whom he deemed horribly ugly at a glance. His heart sank, and he announced that the union could never consummate. The court, caught in this awkward revelation, was compelled to turn private matters into public spectacle. Physicians, lawyers, and senior councillors crowded into the royal bedchamber to assess the king's physiological capacity and determine whether any visible impediment existed. Under the scrutiny of quivering candles, Anne endured whispered critiques of her appearance and veiled jests at her expense. The entire assembly seemed to hold its breath, unsure whether to avert their eyes or stifle their laughter. Despite the humiliation that washed over her, Anne maintained her composure. She bore the shame of being called unfit for royal intimacy and laughed off scolding remarks with quiet dignity. Yet the damage was done. The rumour mill churned ceaselessly, and Anne found herself the subject of ridicule at midday gatherings in the palace courtyard. Courtiers whispered that even the birds outside seemed to mock her, their song a cruel echo of her dashed hopes. Only 3 short months after the ceremonial extravaganza, Henry declared the marriage invalid from the very beginning. He unravelled the union with a stroke of royal decree, stripping Anne of queenly title, but granting her the courtesy status of the king's sister. This curious designation allowed her to retain dignity amid the disgrace. She was awarded generous lands, a princely income, and the freedom to travel unhindered benefits that set her apart from the fate of other discarded consorts. Anne of Cleves thus emerged unscathed in terms of survival. Though she carried the memory of her public rejection, in the hush of late-night feasts, she could recount the tale with neither bitterness nor complaint, for she understood that in Henry's court, favour was as fleeting as candlelight. Her settlement, though scandalous in its exceptions, spoke volumes about the king's true concerns, not lasting alliances or heartfelt affections, but the satisfaction of his immediate desires. This episode laid bare the performative obsession at the heart of Henry's reign. The king had treated marriage as a stage production, complete with false promises and dramatic reversals. He cared little for the political stability that his bride's lineage might secure. His sole preoccupation was his own gratification. The bustling court, once a theatre of solemn ritual, became a carnival of shifting affections where a bride could rise to prominence in a painted portrait, only to be humiliated by the same man who had celebrated her likeness. In the quiet of his chambers, Henry may have reflected on the irony of his actions. A king who had shattered religious authority to wed Anne Boleyn and justify his divine right now found himself overturning a diplomatic treaty at the glance of a disappointed eye. He had engineered the break with Rome to pursue personal passion. Yet here he was, annulling a marriage that no ecclesiastical tribunal had ever fully sanctioned. The power that he wielded so casually seemed both exhilarating and hollow in those private moments. As court life resumed its usual cadence, banquets, hunting parties, and endless council meetings, the spectre of Anne of Cleves' fleeting queenship lingered like a half-remembered dream. Courtiers turned the page swiftly, gossiping instead about the next potential match, the next flattering portrait. But Anne's experience remained a cautionary tale, whispered in corridors and candlelit alcoves in the kingdom of Henry VIII. The royal favour was nothing more than a promissory note, valid only until the king's attention wandered to a new possession. Thus did the saga of Anne of Cleves underscore a grim truth: when personal desire is elevated above all else, policy becomes mere performance. Henry's brief dalliance with her showed that his marriages, far from being bonds of fidelity or instruments of statecraft, were waltzes of whim and spectacle. And as the court yawned through another afternoon of pomp, the hum of palace life carried with it the faint echo of a portrait lover turned public, just an indelible reminder that in Henry's world, the only constant was the pursuit of momentary pleasure. Not long after the fiasco with Anne of Cleves, Henry turned his restless gaze toward his own kin, Lady Catherine Howard, the king's teenage cousin. At barely 15 years of age, Catherine arrived at court with wide, bewildered eyes, her childhood innocence bruised by prior abuses within her own household. The Howard family, eager to curry favour with the throne, presented her to Henry as though offering a most precious jewel. Believing that proximity to royal desire would secure their standing for generations, Henry, now well past 40, swollen with obesity and tormented by a chronic leg sore that wept beneath its bandages, nonetheless felt a rush of triumph at the prospect of a fresh conquest. To him, the sight of Catherine in her youth and vulnerability was like tasting the first sweet fruits of spring. He convinced himself that this time this innocent girl would provide the renewal he craved, a living symbol of his undiminished potency. In reality, Catherine was nothing more than a child compelled to reenact a drama far beyond her years. Their liaison began under the gilded eaves of courtly ceremony, but quickly devolved into a tragedy of manipulated consent. Henry, enthralled by the illusion of her affection, spun a fantasy of mutual devotion, insisting that their private moments were the purest expression of divine will. Catherine, for whom the line between coercion and courtly expectation had long since blurred, followed the script imposed upon her. She offered dutiful smiles and fleeting glances, hoping to satisfy the king's demands, while scarcely comprehending the gravity of her role. Inevitably, the old horrors from Catherine's past cast a shadow over her new life. Rumours circulated that she had known young men before her elevation to queenly status lovers of her own making, albeit in a context no child should endure. When these whispers reached Henry's ears, he felt a rage unlike any he had known. The jealousy that consumed him was more than possessiveness. It was a visceral wound to his imperial pride. How dare she, his bride, have known the embrace of another? In his fury, he decreed that Catherine must answer for her childhood indiscretions. Catherine was arrested under guard, her once silken gowns replaced with coarse wool shrouds. The charges were laid out in cold, precise terms. Adultery, a capital crime when committed against the king. In Henry's twisted jurisprudence, any hint of prior intimacy, however coerced or innocent, was evidence of treasonous betrayal. The court trials that followed were mere formalities, a grotesque pageant of condemnation that left Catherine wide-eyed in terror. Here, uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, pleaded for leniency, but Henry's judgment was unwavering. In the spring of 1542, Catherine was led to Tower Green, the youngest of Henry's 6 wives, to meet her fate at the block. She displayed a heartbreaking mix of bravado and vulnerability, a teenager attempting dignity in the face of an executioner's blade. Her final moments were a murmur of prayers and a silent curl of trembling fingers around a rosary. One can almost hear her soft apologies to God for sins she scarcely understood. As the executioner's hood was drawn down, Catherine's death sent a shockwave through the court and the realm. Never before had so young a queen been consumed by the king's merciless appetite for both sex and power. Her tragic end underscored a grim lesson. No one, not even a child, could evade the fury of Henry's obsessions. Whispers in the corridors spoke of broken families and shattered reputations, of lords who had wagered their daughters' futures on royal favour and lost everything. In the sleep-heavy hush of the palace after her execution, courtiers would tiptoe past closed doors. Exchanging mournful glances, they spoke of Catherine's brief, sorrowful reign as a cautionary tale that in Henry's world, youth offered no protection, innocence no shield. And as they drifted off to restless slumber, the distant echo of her final prayers seemed to linger in the torch's glow, a haunting lullaby for a kingdom forever scarred by a king's unquenchable desires. By the time Henry reached the autumn of his life, he was a shadow of the once vigorous prince. He tipped the scales at over 400 pounds, his legs ravaged by festering sores that oozed through bandages, and whispers in the court spoke of diabetes and declining potency. Yet even in this decrepit state, his appetite for control and companionship remained fierce. In the year 1543, he wed Catherine Parr, a woman 3 decades, his junior, who proved herself the sole survivor among his 6 wives. Catherine arrived at court, bearing the air of a practiced diplomat rather than a trembling bride. Unlike the youthful innocence of Catherine Howard or the resistance of Anne Boleyn, she offered a steady partnership. She assumed the role of nurse and confidante, tending the king's painful leg wounds with gentle ministrations and soothing ointments. She sat by his bedside as he winced through every dressing change, humming soft hymns to calm his frayed nerves. In the hush of the royal chambers, her presence was like a lullaby to his battered body, a welcome reprieve from the cacophony of court intrigues. Beyond physical care, Catherine wielded spiritual authority. England was still reeling from its break with Rome, and the fragile Protestant Church of England depended on royal favour. As supreme head of the Church, Henry's mood swings could ignite religious purges or grant reprieve. Catherine became his moral compass. Tempering his harsher impulses, she encouraged him toward moderate reforms, urging charity for those who held divergent beliefs and advocating mercy for imprisoned clergy. In private councils, she spoke with measured deference, always acknowledging his ultimate authority while steering policy away from bloodshed. Catherine's greatest feat was maintaining the precarious peace between her husband's yearning for absolute power and the court's fear of another bloody purge. She knew that Henry's wrath lay not only in his decrees but also in his wounded pride. By carefully praising his wisdom and framing her suggestions as loyal advice, she kept his ego flattered and his ire subdued. When Parliament debated new heresy laws, she leaned upon the king's love of order, presenting leniency as a means of demonstrating royal magnanimity. In this way, she shielded countless souls from the fate that had befallen Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. In the evenings, Catherine would join Henry in his private chapel, their voices blending in the Anglican liturgy. She guided him through the Psalms, her calm tenor soothing the nightmares that had begun to plague him. Occasionally, he would drift into slumber mid-prayer, and she would let him rest, covering him with a sable cloak and whispering promises of a peaceful transition. Under her influence, the king's final years saw fewer executions and more acts of royal beneficence. He granted pardons to distant cousins, restored estates to families ruined by past religious turmoil, and increased alms for the poor. Yet Catherine's tenure was not without peril. As queen, she walked a tightrope between spiritual leadership and mortal survival. She could not afford to offend the king's shifting religious whims, or appear too sympathetic to reformers whom Henry still viewed with suspicion. When a radical preacher was brought before the Privy Council, Catherine interceded delicately, suggesting that the preacher's good intentions might be guided toward traditional worship rather than outright rebellion. Henry, flattered by her concern for the realm's unity, agreed to spare the preacher's life, imposing a mild house arrest instead. In quieter moments, Catherine would slip away from the palace bustle to the royal gardens, where she walked among the blooms and pondered the fragility of her position. She knew that her survival depended on both her devotion to Henry's comfort and her deft management of his spiritual legacy. Every compliment she paid him, every gentle admonition she offered, was calibrated to keep his love and his temper in balance. She navigated his court with an almost sleepy grace, speaking softly, yet carrying a weight of wisdom that few could match. When Henry's health finally collapsed, it came not in a violent storm, but as a gentle drifting away. Catherine knelt by his side as he slipped into unconsciousness. Praying for his soul and promising to watch over their shared realm, he drew his final breath in her steady presence. His tortured leg at last still. His empire at the cusp of a new era, shaped by the church he had helped to nurture. In death, Henry left behind a testament to the power of both passion and sacrifice. His marriages, once instruments of terror and spectacle, had ended with Catherine's quiet triumph. She had secured her life, protected a fledgling national church, and guided a tortured king toward a death marked more by mercy than by blood. And so, in the drowsy hush that followed his passing, the court whispered of Catherine Parr as the gentle healer who, in the final chapters of Tudor drama, had transformed a reign of desire into a legacy of grace. Under Henry's hand, marriage became more than a sacred union. It evolved into a weapon, a tool of statecraft and terror. He bound discipline, law, and religion to serve his private appetite. The creation of the Church of England placed the monarch above the Pope, rewriting centuries of doctrine overnight. Ecclesiastical courts bowed to royal decree, and every priest in the realm answered directly to the king. In his mind, the sacred rite of matrimony existed to reinforce his omnipotence, not to bind two souls. The crown's new supremacy reverberated through the halls of government. The dissolution of monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541, stripped the abbeys and priories of their vast wealth. Lands once tilled by pious hands passed into Tudor coffers. Funding elaborate weddings, lavish revels, and the construction of opulent palaces. Yet the royal treasury, depleted by endless nuptial extravaganzas and the cost of state executions, remained perilously lean. Every wedding feast, every procession through London's streets, drew upon the spoils of religious houses. emptied stone by stone for the king's desires. Tower of London, that ancient fortress on the Thames, bore witness to Henry's cruelty. Its grim walls echoed with the cries of noble wives accused of betrayal. Anne Boleyn's head fell on the scaffold within its confines. Catherine Howard crept through its corridors in woolen rags before facing the block. Behind those iron gates, the machinery of so-called justice clicked into place. Judges, appointed by royal favour, expanded the definition of treason to include sexual betrayal against the king, a whisper of indiscretion, a childhood dalliance, or a bartered exchange of affection was enough to summon the knife. Hampton Court Palace, once a retreat of joyful masks and festive revelry, too became a stage for terror. Its tapestry-lined chambers dripped with the secrets of countless love affairs turned nightmares. Here Henry had dissolved his first marriage. Here he had discarded wives like garments, each abandonment sanctioned by his own hand. The corridors felt heavy with the ghosts of those who had entered as queens and departed as traitors. Even the grand kitchens, where cooks prepared sumptuous banquets, stirred with hush and trepidation. As servants recalled the fates of fallen consorts, the laws of succession, once stable pillars of dynastic continuity, shifted as whims dictated. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, each child's legitimacy fluctuated with Henry's mood and marital status. Statutes passed by Parliament could legitimate or disinherit heirs in a single act, uprooting families and sowing confusion. Noble bloodlines trembled, unsure if their sons would ascend the throne or be declared bastards beneath a new decree. The very concept of inheritance became a gamble, determined by the king's private desires rather than the steady hand of tradition. The national budget bore the scars of Henry's campaigns, both martial and amorous. Financing wars in France and Scotland strained the realm, but it was the costs of Tudor romance that truly drained the exchequer. Lavish trousseaux, diplomatic bribes wrapped in silk, and jewels destined for female hands emptied vaults faster than tax revenue could refill them. The dissolution of monasteries provided a temporary windfall, but even that proved insufficient for the king's endless appetite. By the time he lay dying, the coffers were all but bare, propped only by loans and the pledges of fearful magnates. Religion, once the anchor of medieval kingship, became malleable at Henry's command. Anglican clergy adapted their sermons to flatter the sovereign, preaching that his marital choices were divine necessity. Those who resisted faced fines, imprisonment, or the stake. The poor monks and nuns who had lived simple, prayerful lives suddenly found themselves evicted, their churches sold for profit, their altars stripped of silver, parishioners, confused by the rapid succession of reforms, whispered in hushed tones about the spectacle of persecution, recalling stories of trembling friars dragged to London for refusing to acknowledge the king's supremacy. Under the heavy mantle of night, courtiers would nod off at candlelit tables, murmuring prayers for deliverance from another royal edict. They knew that at any moment, Henry might decree a new act of succession, a fresh marriage, or another dissolution that would rearrange the landscape of land ownership and alter their fortunes forever. The kingdom slumbered uneasily, its fate bound to the sleeping patterns of a monarch who had weaponized love and faith in service of his boundless desires. And so, the legacy of Henry VIII's transformations endured like a half-remembered dream, a realm where marriage was less about companionship and more about conquest, where law was reshaped to punish intimacy, and where religion folded to the will of one man's longings. In the sleepy hush of post-prandial whispers and dozing embers, the realm recalled the price of absolute power pressed into service of absolute desire. When Henry VIII drew his final breath in the year 1547, he departed this world, convinced of his own righteousness, his heart untroubled by remorse. In his last testament, he ordered that his body be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only queen who had given him a male heir. This singular choice revealed the depth of his convictions. The worth of a person, in his eyes, was measured by their ability to produce a son, to continue the Tudor line. As the funeral rites concluded, the bells of Westminster Abbey tolled a sombre melody, echoing the end of an era defined by passion, cruelty, and the relentless pursuit of progeny. Henry's body, garbed in regal finery, lay in state, a monument to a lifetime of extravagant marriages and merciless repudiations. Courtiers filed past in whispered silence, each step a reminder of the king's capricious favour and the violence that had settled over the realm in his name. In the wake of his death, his children Mary Tudor, Elizabeth Tudor, and Edward Tudor found themselves thrust into a world shaped by their father's obsessions. Edward, now King Edward VI, was barely 9 years old when he ascended the throne. His tutors and guardians, mindful of Henry's legacy, taught him not only the rituals of kingship, but also the dark lessons of unchecked authority. They impressed upon him the importance of tempering power with compassion. Though the boy, King's health was as fragile as his father's had once been, Mary, the firstborn, grew up in the chilling shadow of her father's religious reversals and marital dramas. She had witnessed the annulment of her mother, the humiliation of Anne Boleyn, and the execution of Catherine Howard. These memories, woven into her childhood, shaped her determination to restore the old church and enforce a stricter moral order. Yet her reign, brief though it was, revealed the perils of zealotry, another lesson born of Henry's example, as she too wielded authority in the name of faith, only to find that fear and bloodshed left wounds as deep as those inflicted by her father. Elizabeth, the youngest Tudor princess, matured in a court still haunted by courtly whispers and the knowledge that her legitimacy had shifted with each of Henry's 6 marriages. She learned early on to navigate treacherous currents of intrigue, to project calm dignity, even as her heart trembled beneath layers of fine silks. Her education stressed prudence and patience, virtues meant to counter the chaotic whims that had defined her father's reign. Yet it was this very legacy of unpredictable rulership that hardened her resolve to steer clear of religious extremism and marital pandemonium, favouring a policy of moderation and national unity when she eventually took the throne. Together, these 3 heirs embodied the Tudor lesson that authority unfettered by moral restraint becomes tyranny. Their childhoods, coloured by the tumult of their father's bedchamber and battlefields, instilled in them a wariness of power's double edge. In council chambers, they heard repeated admonitions. Beware the conflation of private desire with public duty. Their tutors recited the tragic fates of their mother, their aunt, and their half-sisters, a litany of caution against allowing personal craving to dictate statecraft. Posterity, too, would remember Henry VIII as the monarch who fused the crown with the narrow confines of his own will. Subsequent generations of rulers studied his life as though it were a morbid catechism. They drew clear boundaries between the sovereign's personal appetites and the obligations of office, crafting laws and traditions to ensure that no future monarch could repudiate a spouse or dissolve a church at a whim. The notion of a divine right to absolute power, once galvanized by Henry's assertion of supremacy over Rome, encountered new skepticism. Parliamentarians reminded themselves that legislation must reflect the common good, not the bent desires of a single individual. Ecclesiastical courts reclaimed independence, chafing against the memory of bishops, who once trembled at the king's command. Legal scholars penned treatises on the separation of the monarch's private affairs from the administration of justice, wary of treason statutes that had once been stretched to ensnare innocent victims accused of sexual betrayal. Even the architecture of court life bore the imprint of Henry's reign. Hampton Court Palace, once echoing with the laughter of banquets and sonorous music, stood as a testament to both grandeur and dread. The Tower of London, its walls soaked in the blood of ill-fated queens, became a museum of cautionary tales. Visitors roamed its chambers, reading names etched into stone. Each syllable a warning of the dangers of unmoderated monarchy. And so, in the sleepy hush of Tudor memoirs and whispered anecdotes, the story of Henry's exploits became a lullaby for statesmen and émigrés alike, a half-forgotten refrain reminding them that ultimate power requires ultimate vigilance. For if a sovereign's personal passions can redefine religion, rewrite laws, and send loved ones to the block, then the line between public office and private appetite must remain ever unbreached. Thus, as the years rolled on and a new age dawned, the memory of Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of male heirs served as both a testament and a lesson. His tomb, flanked by Jane Seymour's repose, offered a silent admonition. Human worth transcends the mere act of begetting, and the true measure of a ruler lies not in the heirs he sired, but in the justice and mercy he dispenses. And in the quiet twilight of history, that is the line posterity vowed never again to cross after Henry VIII proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England. The centuries-old religious structure in England was rent asunder. Once, all religious orders and monastic houses answered to the teachings of Rome and served the Pope. Now, every priest, monk, and nun took their orders from a king who wore the mitre as readily as a crown. Between 1536 and 1540, the so-called dissolution of the monasteries ripped through the land, not merely seizing church property, but delivering an economic and social earthquake. Estates and lands, long tended by devout brothers and sisters, were wrested from cloisters and redistributed to Henry's loyal nobles, or spent on lavish royal weddings and pensions for politically defeated rivals. The consequences were profound. Thousands of monks and nuns found themselves suddenly homeless, forced to beg or seek meagre livelihoods. Schools once run by clergy closed their doors, leaving students stranded without instruction. Peasant villages lost their spiritual anchors as abbeys that had provided charity, shelter, and counsel vanished overnight. The common folk soon grasped that this sweeping change was no mere liturgical tweak but an early capitalist revolution. A new landed gentry, enriched by confiscated church estates, rose swiftly, while the medieval safety net disintegrated under bourgeois ambitions. Though conceived to legitimize Henry's annulment of his marriage to Catherine and secure his dynastic aims, the Church of England outlived its founder many times over. The local parishes remained intact, yet they now answered to the crown rather than to Rome. Clergy were appointed or dismissed by royal writ, and sermons reflected the monarch's will more than any papal decree. Most importantly, Henry's flexible marriage laws enabling annulments and redefining legitimacy endured as a peculiar Tudor legacy. One could, by act of Parliament, dissolve a union almost at will, and heirs once legitimated could swiftly find themselves bastards again under a new statute. Yet genuine religious freedom did not wait long in this newly national church. Under Henry's children, the pendulum of doctrine swung with each monarch's convictions. Edward VI's regents pushed ever more Protestant reforms, only for Mary Tudor to restore papal allegiance in a bloody purge. Then Elizabeth I emerged, determined to establish a via media that pleased neither zealot completely. Her reign saw fierce clashes between Catholics and Protestants, as each side jockeyed for power. Despite the Elizabethan settlement, occasional plots and brutal reprisals marked her tenure, including public executions for heresy that echoed the worst excesses of her father's policies. In sum, Henry's religious legacy laid the groundwork for a robust nationalism in England, severing external ecclesiastical ties and insisting that no foreign power could dictate church affairs. But this newfound independence came at a price. It ignited decades of turmoil in the 16th and 17th centuries. As Crown and Parliament vied to shape religious policy, bishops sat in the House of Lords. Peasants and noble alike watched sermons for political cues, and state and church became entwined in an incessant power struggle. In the sleepy stillness of post-dissolution England, those who recalled the chanting of Benedictine monks or the shelter of cooling cloisters felt a subtle longing for what had been lost. Though kingly supremacy endured, so did the memory of a time when faith and charity flowed from the monasteries. The fractured heritage of Henry VIII divorced marriages, confiscated lands, and an autonomous church remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that when religion is weaponized to serve personal desire, the social and spiritual fabric of a nation can unravel in fits and starts, leaving generations haunted by the echoes of shattered cloisters and contested pulpits. The transformation of marriage into a political weapon under Henry VIII plunged the Tudor court into an unending maelstrom of factional crisis. Over the course of 6 marriages, courtiers and noble families shifted their loyalties like dancers in a restless waltz. Some championed the bride who had vanished into divorce, while others lined up behind the new queen, laws of succession first pronouncing Edward legitimate. Then Mary, then Elizabeth were rewritten repeatedly, breeding widespread uncertainty about the true heir to the throne. No one was safe from sudden downfall. Sir Thomas More, once the king's trusted counsellor and moral exemplar, dared to question Henry's marriage policies and religious reforms. For his principled stand, he was charged with high treason and met his end under the executioner's axe. Thomas Cromwell, the master architect behind the dissolution of the monasteries and the break with Rome, ultimately outlived his usefulness in the king's eyes. He too was condemned, his head severed for crimes, swiftly conjured by royal decree. The nobility learned a bitter lesson. Proximity to the king offered dazzling opportunity, but the same closeness could become a lethal danger. Beyond England's borders, the continent watched in bewilderment as a once steady ally fractured ties with Spain. The divorce from Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs, ruptured the long-standing alliance with the greatest power in Western Europe. Meanwhile, the so-called partnerships with Protestant princes in Germany and the Netherlands wavered with each new betrothal and annulment. England drifted into a diplomatic no-man's land, a junior partner in European affairs, because every foreign policy decision hinged on Henry's personal whims. True, modern diplomacy, built on cohesive national interest, had barely begun to take shape in the early 16th century. But the Tudor court's capricious personal demands stalled even those embryonic efforts. Inside Westminster's hallowed halls, Parliament was summoned again and again, not to debate national strategy or fiscal reform, but merely to pass acts enabling yet another annulment or to legitimize the seizure of church lands. A body that might have functioned as a guardian of the realm's welfare became, instead, a rubber stamp for royal desire. Lords and knights, clad in sumptuous robes, would shuffle to the bar to nod assent to bills dissolving monastic orders, then retire to the painted chamber to whisper prayers for their own safety. The Commons, once a forum for tempestuous debate, now muttered their acquiescence under the stern eyes of royal commissioners. This politicization of legislation marked a dark turning point, the dissolution of any meaningful separation between the sovereign's private appetites and the machinery of government. Laws once crafted for the common good were now instruments of personal will. Noble estates changed hands with dizzying frequency, as Parliament authorised the sale of church lands to fund a queen's dowry or to provide pensions for those who lost favour. The very concept of the rule of law of stable, predictable governance faded behind the spectacle of despotism disguised as legislation. In hushed tones, advisers speculated on the next move, an act to legitimize a favoured bastard, a new bill to disinherit a daughter born of a rival marriage, or perhaps another statutory pretext to banish disobedient bishops. The Tudor court, once the seat of England's greatest cultural flowering, became a theatre of constant legal improvisation. Each new statute carried the memory of the last, echoing the lesson that in Henry's reign, the statute books were as mutable as the king's own heart. Yet sleep claimed the weary courtiers eventually. In the small hours, they would drift in and out of dozes by candlelight, murmuring half-formed prayers that the next summons to Parliament might never come. They knew that at dawn, another royal whim might summon them to debate the king's latest marital machination or to vote on another confiscation of church wealth. And so, as the torches guttered and the draughts creaked through Westminster's ancient arches, the realm slumbered under the uneasy guard of laws too often bent to fit one man's desires, an enduring testament to the perils of entangling personal passion with the governance of a kingdom, from the humblest cottages to the gilded halls of noble estates. An atmosphere of dread hovered over England. No one could say when a whispered infidelity would be exposed, or when the king's perverse desires would be enshrined in law. Portraits of Henry's wives, once painted in glowing colour, were scrubbed white, their names excised from palace rosters. Hampton Court Palace and the Tower of London, once proud seats of regal pageantry, became grim museums of horror, each chamber echoing with the faint cries of discarded consorts. In the realm of art and letters, any mention of royal sexuality teetered on the edge of peril. Poets and chroniclers learned to mask their verses in layers of allegory and oblique reference. The word divorce vanished from polite discourse, replaced by fragrant metaphors of wilting flowers or shifting sands. Execution became a forbidden term. Writers spoke instead of the final sunset or the court's grave decree. A courtly ode that once celebrated a queen's beauty now offered veiled praise of her radiant favour. Every line a carefully measured compliment, or its equally delicate reverse, a backhanded slight. The tradition of courtly poetry, once a flourishing garden of romantic aspiration, wilted under the weight of political necessity. Patrons commissioned elegies to exalt the current queen's virtues, only to sweep those same verses into obscurity when a new consort claimed the throne. A single misplaced compliment could land a poet in the Tower, leading him to compose in frightened whispers, his quill trembling at the thought that a misplaced metaphor might offend the sovereign's latest intrigue. Among the nobility, young girls were schooled in the fine art of invisibility from earliest childhood. They were taught to master graceful deportment, to hold their heads high, but their gazes low, and to measure every step for fear of catching a dangerous glance. Riding lessons, once the mark of a well-rounded gentlewoman, now included drills in sidestepping the king's notice. At lessons for music and poetry, tutors inserted drills on how to mask one's blush or deflect compliments with a curt bow. Remember, mothers whispered at dawn, avoid the king's eyes, for they may linger longer than his mercy. Court etiquette transformed into a curriculum of self-preservation. Debutantes learned not only to curtsy to peers, but to read the subtle flicker of royal favour. They practiced smiles that conveyed polite distance, mastered the art of handing the king a flower from his own garden without meeting his gaze, and rehearsed brief replies that would neither flatter too deeply nor offend by indifference. Each gesture, each syllable, was part of a delicate dance meant to keep one's virtue and one's life intact. Meanwhile, conversations in drawing rooms and kitchens alike turned to hushed murmurs of recipes for invisibility. Noble mothers exchanged notes on which fabrics absorbed light best, making their daughters less conspicuous in candlelit banquets. Lady-in-waiting instructors taught tricks of posture so that one could appear engaged in embroidery rather than in the monarch's presence. Even ballads sung at family gatherings became warnings couched in nursery rhyme. Beware the gaze that lingers at the feast. Hide your heart when power whispers at your sleeve. In the broader culture, playwrights drifted toward biblical themes or classical myths, fearful that any portrayal of a monarch's private life, however veiled, might incur royal wrath. A script about Medea's wrath or Dido's exile could be staged only if the parallels to court intrigues remained imperceptible. Audiences, accustomed to drawing their own conclusions, read between the poetic lines. A queen's lament in a myth was as much about Catherine as it was about Clytemnestra. Even the taverns felt the chill of caution. Patrons who dared to jest about split weddings or lost heads did so in half-formed sentences, eyes flicking toward the door, lest a palace spy overhear. Scholars kept journals of Tudor events under lock and key, writing, "He who must not be named" instead of "the king" in footnotes. It became common to wipe quills clean after each note, as though hoping to erase even the memory of dangerous thoughts. Thus, the Tudor court's erotic politics seeped into every corner of English life. Fear became a constant companion, teaching even the most innocent to guard their steps and words. Artistic expression bent under invisible shackles, while the nobility trained their daughters in the art of survival rather than mere refinement, and as the realm dozed through candlelit nights and half-forgotten verses, every soul sensed the unspoken truth in a kingdom where a monarch's private whims could reshape law and history. Discretion was not merely wisdom, it was the only safeguard. Henry VIII transformed the very nature of English law, bending its spirit to serve his personal desires. Under his reign, the crime of adultery was recast as an act of high treason against the crown. A whisper of infidelity, no matter how private, could become evidence of plotting against the sovereign himself. Meanwhile, succession laws decreed that every subject must recognize the king's current offspring as the true heirs, regardless of previous declarations. To deny a queen's child was to deny the crown's legitimacy and invite the harshest penalties. Even the simple refusal to obey a royal command could be prosecuted as rebellion. What had once been a boundary between throne and subject collapsed under the weight of Henry's restless appetite for control, turning every statute into a blade that could slice through noble fortunes and reputations alike. This fusion of personal will and legal force extended far beyond the bedchamber. By framing adultery as treason, Henry sent a stark message. Sexual loyalty to the monarch was as binding as military fealty. Courtiers learned to fear the implications of a heated glance or a stolen dalliance. In one breath, the king could forgive a political rival, and in the next, condemn a beloved court poet for an offhand compliment deemed too intimate. The law became a mirror of the king's vanity, reflecting every capricious whim back onto the realm. At the heart of this transformation lay Henry's reimagining of royal succession. He decreed that legitimacy was not a matter of birthright alone, but a function of the current marriage recognized by his own hand. A child born of his union with Catherine could be disinherited if Henry later deemed that union invalid. A daughter born to Anne could be declared legitimate, but only until a better opportunity arose. Parliament, once a guardian of hereditary rights, became an instrument for rewriting the family tree at the king's command. Families who had celebrated their children's future prospects in one generation found themselves stripped of titles in the next, as though each statute merely erased the ink of the previous one. The law of disobedience, too, assumed new terror. Obeying the king's pleasure meant navigating a labyrinth of shifting commands. One day, an order to support a foreign expedition might be hailed as patriotic duty. The next, refusal to fund a royal wedding could be branded as sedition. Nobles who hesitated over a vote in the Privy Council discovered that their hesitation might cost them head and lands. The line between conscience and crime blurred, leaving every man to wonder when the next royal decree would ensnare him. Yet out of this legal chaos emerged a countervailing principle that would resonate through the centuries: the notion that foreign powers must not meddle in England's religious affairs. Henry's act of supplanting the Pope's authority with his own inaugurated an early form of national sovereignty. He asserted that matters of faith and governance lay squarely within the bounds of English soil, beyond external interference. This principle of domestic control over the Church would later crystallize into the doctrine of non-intervention, fostering a sense of national unity in the face of continental rivals. However, Henry's habit of rewriting laws at his pleasure sowed the seeds of deeper discord. His successors, having inherited a system in which statutes could flex to royal will, found themselves tempted by the same prerogative. In the reign of Charles I, the notion of absolute obedience re-emerged. As the king sought to impose taxes and religious reforms without parliamentary consent, he leaned upon the examples set by Henry VIII, claiming that prerogative allowed him to govern unilaterally. Parliament resisted, insisting that statutes must reflect the Commonwealth's will, not the monarch's whim. Thus, the conflict between Crown and Commons ignited the English Civil War, What began under Henry as a tool of personal pleasure and dynastic ambition mutated into a constitutional crisis about the limits of royal authority. The practice of legal caprice, first established to enforce the king's private desires, now threatened the very fabric of governance. In city halls and manor courts, citizens debated whether any man, even a monarch, could stand above the law. In the sleepy hush of post-Henrician England, the echoes of those turbulent years lingered. Chronicles recorded not only the grand battles and sieges, but also the quieter skirmishes in chancery courts, where disputed titles and contested inheritances played out. Judges, who once trembled at the king's signet, gradually reclaimed their independence, asserting that no statute could override the common law's ancient protections. Lawyers penned treatises on the divine right of kings, tempered by the rule of law, a delicate balance learned at great cost. By the time the Stuarts faced their reckoning, the nation had absorbed a profound lesson. Unchecked power, wielded through malleable statutes, could devastate both individual liberty and national stability. The legal innovations of Henry VIII, once celebrated for their bold assertion of sovereignty, had become cautionary tales. In their wake, England forged a new constitutional framework, one designed to prevent any future monarch from merging personal passion with the letter of the law. Yet even as Parliament wrote fresh statutes to limit royal prerogative, the memory of Henry's reign hovered like a half-forgotten dream. His laws, etched in the dusty tomes of statute books, served as reminders of how quickly legal certainty could dissolve in the steam of a monarch's desire. And in the dim glow of candlelit archives, scholars would murmur that the greatest safeguard against tyranny lay not solely in statutes, but in the vigilance of a free people determined to keep personal longing from becoming law. When Henry VIII breathed his last in the year 1547, he was a monument to excess. His body weighed well over 400 pounds. His rotting leg wound, a constant source of agony, and whispered rumours of diabetes and impotence clung to his courtly reputation. Yet even in death, he showed no hint of remorse for the trail of devastation he had carved through his kingdom. His final will directed that he be interred beside Jane Seymour, the one queen who had borne him a son, underscoring the sole measure by which he judged human worth, the production of a male heir. Behind the velvet curtains of his funeral cortege lay the bloody record of his reign. Thousands of noble and common women had been swept up as pawns in his relentless game of desire. Mistresses and wives alike found themselves elevated, abandonnés, or executed as his lust and ambition dictated. Laws had been twisted until adultery equaled treason. Succession statutes rewritten to suit a whim. And the fabric of English society stretched thin by endless annulments and beheadings. The dissolution of monasteries had turned sacred refuges into warehouses of Tudor largesse, dismantling centuries of spiritual life. The church he created, though outliving him many times over, bore the stain of its origin, a tool forged to legitimize one man's personal appetites. Perhaps the deepest lesson Henry left behind was that unchecked power is a perilous gift. A single individual, empowered without restraint, can warp every relationship, marital bonds, religious authority, and the rule of law until they serve personal ambition rather than the common good. In his relentless drive to satisfy both carnal and dynastic desires, Henry had shown how easily a society's foundations could crack. Trust dissolved at the royal command. Neighbours learned to eye one another with suspicion, for any whispered tale could become the seed of accusation. From the silent corridors of Hampton Court, once echoing with joyous music and courtly laughter, to the marble halls of Westminster, where laws were spun from personal fancy, the legacy of Henry's reign still whispered caution. Portraits of his discarded queens, whitewashed on palace walls, spoke of lives erased and reputations hollowed. Statute books, stained with marginal notes, bore witness to the ease with which statutes could be bent to desire. And in every pulpit of the Church of England, an unspoken truth endured: religion, had been reshaped to justify a monarch's whim, not to guide a nation's soul. In the decades that followed, England would struggle to rebuild the bridges Henry had burned. His children Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth would each grapple with the consequences of their father's legal and spiritual upheavals. Parliaments convened to restore limits on royal prerogative, seeking to fortify the realm against future caprice. Judges asserted the primacy of common law to protect the innocent from charges of sexual treason. Bishops carefully distanced their sermons from the memories of enforced oaths, reminding congregations that faith must stand apart from personal ultramutations of power. Yet the spectre of Henry's tyranny never fully faded, even as reforms took root. The possibility of a ruler wielding desire as a weapon remained a cautionary shadow. Every successive monarch learned to balance personal inclination with institutional duty, knowing that the people's loyalty could unravel when a king's private passions overshadowed his public responsibilities. The delicate architecture of English governance, anchored in laws, traditions, and a fledgling sense of parliamentary oversight, stood as a bulwark against the worst of absolutism. As the realm drifted toward more stable times, poets once more dared to mention love and marriage without fear. Yet they did so with a hushed reverence, mindful that the language of courtly affection had once served as the veneer for a regime of terror. In drawing rooms and libraries, noble women taught their daughters not only the arts of wit and decorum, but also the importance of discerning political undercurrents beneath polite conversation. And commoners, recounting stories beside hearth fires, passed on the moral, beware the ruler who sees law and faith as instruments of personal desire. For such a man can transform even the most sacred bond into an instrument of state violence. Thus, in the sleepy hush that follows the final candle's gutter, the realm still hears the faint echo of Henry's lust-forged statutes and his sanguine marriages. They serve as a lasting reminder that concentrated power, if left unchecked, will not merely serve ambition, but will turn intimate desire into an engine of terror. And though time may soften the edges of memory, history holds one verdict: ever constant, absolute power, married to personal appetite, is an unholy union. And the price paid by society will be both steep and unforgettable. The story of Henry VIII is not only a chilling royal tragedy, but also offers viewers profound lessons about human nature and the workings of power. First, we see clearly that when an individual concentrates absolute authority without any checks and balances, even the most sacred relationships such as marriage or faith can be manipulated to serve personal ambition. Henry VIII turned sexuality into a political weapon, marriage into a means of legitimizing power, and religion into a guarantor for demands that defied moral principle. Second, the narrative warns us of the fragility of law and ethics when they are subject solely to the ruler's will. Adultery was recast as treason, divorce was granted by Act of Parliament, and hanging and beheading became solutions for sexual transgressions. All of this demonstrates that law ceased to be the common standard of society and became merely a tool to enact personal whims. We learn that a healthy political system must rest on the principles of limited power, just laws, and effective checks on authority, rather than revolving arbitrarily around a single individual. Third, Henry VIII's religious legacy, though it forged an independent Church of England, also laid the foundation for religious violence and conflict across generations. Changing canon law to annul marriages and seizing monastic properties destroyed the medieval safety net of spiritual welfare and sparked ongoing religious crises. This reminder shows us that religious freedom is not merely the right to affirm belief, but also the responsibility to protect the spiritual and cultural fabric of a community. Finally, this video helps us understand that history is more than distant events. It is a mirror reflecting present dangers whenever power goes unchecked and personal interest is placed above the common good. Society pays the price in instability, division, and suffering. Viewers take away the message that only a balance between the rule of law, public morality, and mechanisms to control authority can build a sustainable society. Thus, through the story of Henry VIII, We learn to cherish the principles of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, only when power is shared and individual conduct is constrained by common law and ethics. Can every bond from family to faith, from society to nation, endure in trust and justice?